Good morning, St. John's. It's good to have everybody here this morning, whether you're in the pews or with us in the online balcony. And looking around and see a few new faces, at least new to me. So if you're our guest today, please know that we are especially happy to have you with us. So y'all have landed today, for one reason or another, in an Episcopal church. Congratulations. A huge part of being an Episcopalian is that you and I are what we would call sacramental people. What does that mean? It means that we are the kind of people who believe that somehow, some way, our God is the kind of God who uses ordinary things to make extraordinary things happen. We practice the sacraments, things like baptism and Eucharist, and yes, there are 5 others. It's kind of like naming the 7 dwarfs off the top of your head. It's hard to do even if you've been to seminary, but it's all there in the prayer book. The core ones, though, are baptism and Eucharist. And we practice these not because we just like tradition or we think they're good symbols. No, we practice the sacraments because we believe that in those holy moments made with ordinary things that become holy things, God reliably presses through into our world and makes God's self known. To us, the sacraments are an inbreaking, a punching through between heaven and earth. They're like a holy invasion of God's grace into our lives. Because we are sacramental people, we believe that our God is the kind of God who is still interested in our lives. Our God is the kind of God who still shows up. Our God is the kind of God who intervenes. That's a huge part of what it means for us to be sacramental people. With that in mind, and especially the word intervene in mind, I want us to take a look at today's gospel lesson and see what we see about this God who delights in intervening in our lives. So today's gospel is a story about healing. And as you've heard me say about this story before, this story is what we would call a healing sandwich. It begins and ends with the story of a man named Jairus whose daughter is dying, and he wants Jesus to come and intervene. But dropped right smack into the middle of it is the story of a woman who grabs hold of Jesus while he's walking because she too needs an intervention. And out of this whole healing sandwich, there are 3 points that I want us to think about today. Lucky y'all, this is one of my 3-pointer sermons, so you know when it's going to be over. You're welcome. Number 1, God wishes to intervene in our lives, but we do have to be receptive. Number 2, God does intervene in our lives, but not always in the way that we want him to. And number 3, most importantly, Jesus is your intervention. So let's get into that a little bit. Number 1, God wishes to intervene in our lives, but we have to be receptive. Anyone who has ever been to AA or any of the other 12-step programs knows that admitting you need help really is always the very first step. That's not good just in AA. That's good to know in life. Admitting that you need help is always the first step. We human beings, especially we Americans, we are just so determined to be so self-reliant that we always feel like everything is completely up to us. But scratch the surface and you soon find out that none of us know what we're doing. All of us are on the edge, and we all wish someone would come in and fix it all up and make it all better. I remember when I was a kid growing up at Christ Episcopal Church in Valdosta, Georgia, and I was having a conversation with a woman named Phyllis, this wise woman in our congregation, and we're sitting there in the church kitchen, and I said, Phyllis, I must have been like 14, I said, it gets easier when you're older, right? Like when you're a grown-up, it's easier, right? And she said, oh, Lonnie, what you don't know is that we're all still waiting for the grown-ups to show up and tell us what to do. Y'all, that is the human predicament, and that is what grace is for. We don't have all the answers, and that's okay. But the funny thing about grace is that while it's always there and it's always free, you can't receive it if you don't want it. The same is true of things like healing, forgiveness, and love. And so you and I can take a big lesson from the people in today's gospel story. Both Jairus and the woman with the hemorrhage have both admitted that they cannot deal with their problems on their own. And so, quite literally, they reach out. They throw away their self-reliance. They throw away their pride. They throw themselves at Jesus. Honestly, I think this is how you and I should come to this rail every single week. Not groveling, not as sinful supplicants, but simply as people who know we need help and who know where to find it and who expect our loving God to actually show up and care. By the way, notice what Jesus does when he finally does go inside to heal Jairus' daughter. He looks at all the hand-wringers and all the naysayers who are there in the house. What does he do with them? He puts them outside. Now, if we had to put all the hand-wringers and naysayers, if we had to put everybody who has any doubt outside of St. John's, well, then we'd be an empty church, because all of us have some sort of doubt. All of us have things that we're questioning and working through. So the lesson there is not that you got to be all in to be in. The lesson there is whatever the naysayer, whatever the hand-wringer, whatever the worrier is in you, find ways to put it out so that Jesus can be more present and able to do his work. God's grace is always ready to intervene, but first we have to be receptive. Number 2, God does intervene, but God's interventions don't always look like what we hope they will look like. Think about poor Jairus. Jairus has come to Jesus ready and receptive because he knows that Jesus is the only one who can possibly heal his daughter. So off they go on their way to get this done, and then boom, while Jesus is walking, a woman reaches out and grabs his cloak, hoping for healing for herself. So you know what this is like for Jesus in some ways, because I'm sure that you, just like I, have been pulled in too many directions at one or more times in your life. You know that feeling of having people needing you from this direction and this direction and this direction. But you also know what it's like for Jairus, waiting on others for something that you urgently need. But Jesus stops everything, and he gives this woman his full attention. Mark, who wrote this gospel, says this woman told Jesus the whole truth, which is Mark's diplomatic way of saying she talked for a long time. So imagine being Jairus. Your daughter is dying. You need Jesus to hurry up and get over there now. There is no time for this. They finally do get there, and the little girl has died. And with sadness and despair, everybody thinks, well, that's that. Let's don't trouble the teacher anymore. They cannot imagine that even Jesus can intervene at this point. But then he surprises them all. We look to God to intervene in our lives kind of a lot, especially when we come to this rail for communion and healing, but not only here, also in our daily lives. When we're in the hospital, when our loved ones are at hospice, or just when life is tricky or hard or doesn't seem to be going the way that we think it should. We call on God to intervene all the time, but it is not ours to dictate what that intervention will look like. Back at my last congregation, it had a particular spiritual gift for healing. Every church, I think, has particular spiritual gifts that apply to that church in a special way. Here, I think we have lots of special spiritual gifts, one of them being the gift of music, just to name one. But at that congregation, the gift of healing was one of their tremendous spiritual gifts. What I mean is that when communion was over, everybody had come up to the rail and received communion, the music would keep on going. It would never stop. And people just knew that if they were seeking healing for themselves or for the sake of another, and body, mind, or spirit, that they could come back up to the rail and kneel. And not only would I go along and put my hands on their head and anoint them with oil and say a prayer for them, but other members of the congregation would come up around them and lay their hands on. All different kinds of people would do this, and it was a holy, holy, holy moment every single week. In one week, kind of early in my time there, a woman showed up. I didn't know her, and she knelt down, and she said, "I'm praying for my husband." So I laid hands on her, and we prayed, and then kept on going. And the next week she showed up, and the next week she showed up. Friends had told her, "You ought to come to my church. There's this healing thing we do, and you might find it helpful." So in time, what I found out is that her husband had brain cancer. And so I realized that's what we were praying for. We were praying for his healing and for her healing every single week as we went. And finally, the time came when he did pass away. That also happened right about the same time that she gave birth to their second child. And so, as I recall, we had a funeral and a baptism all right around the same time. It was a hard time in their lives. And then life went on, and she met someone wonderful and brought him into the life of our congregation, and we loved him. And the two of them got married, and he also had a son who he brought into the family. But before you know it, they were back at the rail because her new husband's son developed the same kind of cancer that her husband had had. And so there we are at the rail. We're saying our prayers, and saying our prayers, and saying our prayers, week after week after week, the whole congregation coming up around them and laying hands on their shoulders and hoping and praying for an intervention. And then in time, her new stepson did pass away. And the story does have a happy ending. The two of them, the parents, are doing great. Their kids are doing great. It's been a lot of years since that happened, but I remember talking to her years later, because even I as a priest struggled with, what were we doing? What were we seeking? What were we hoping that God would do there? And so I asked her one day, and I said, what do you make of this, of healing prayer, of this particular sacrament in our life? Because honestly, it didn't save your husband's life, and it didn't save your stepson's life. And she paused and she said, Oh, but Father Lonnie, don't you realize? Yeah, healing prayer at our communion rail, you're right, it didn't save my husband's life. It didn't save my stepson's life. But it absolutely saved my life. We don't always get the exact intervention that we're looking for. Sometimes instead, what we receive are things like strength and community and love and grace and a hand on our shoulder from the people in our beloved community for the facing of our most difficult hours. I'm convinced to this day that God worked a healing, a long-term healing, over all those Sundays, over all those years in that place with that family. Either way, the thing is, God interceded. God always intercedes. It just might not look like the way that we would hope or think it would. And that leads me to my last point, which is the simplest yet the most important. And that is this. The reason we believe in the sacraments, the reason we believe that God punches through and intervenes in our life, the reason we believe that God is available in the ordinary and in the present moment, taking ordinary things and making them holy, is because he already did it through Jesus. Y'all, Jesus was the great intervention, and he still is. I started by saying that we're sacramental people, that we're the kind of people who believe that through ordinary things and through our ordinary gatherings, that God punches through our reality to give us the grace we need. I hope we believe that. Otherwise, I'm not sure why we're here. But the thing you need to know today is that before any of that was ever possible, there was Jesus. It's possible because of Jesus. Jesus is God punching through into our reality. Jesus is God giving us the grace we need. As we see in today's gospel story, and frankly every story in every gospel, Jesus is God healing our sick, raising our dead, loving our souls. Y'all, Jesus is your intervention. Jesus is the greatest sacrament of all, and on him all the other sacraments hang. So, how you doing today? Are you having any trouble at all making it on your own? Maybe not. I hope not. I hope you're having a good day. But if you're having any trouble making it on your own, or if you're finding yourself in need of a good intervention, or just of some love, healing, inclusion, or grace, well, join the club. We meet here every week. And if it helps, just know that when you're open to the possibility, and when you know that it might not look exactly as you would hope it would, you can always, always bet your sweet cheeks that the lover of your soul stands ever ready to show up in your life and intervene. Amen.